just woke up and our back door was open. We can't go to bed.
Haleigh Cummings disappeared from her father's home in Florida 1 week ago, but police are now scaling back their search while they wait for more tips.
February 9th, 2009, 3:27 in the morning, a frantic 911 call pierces through the silence of a small Florida town. A 17-year-old girl is screaming into the phone. Her boyfriend's daughter is gone. The back door is wide open, and what she says next will haunt investigators for over a decade. But here's what nobody knew that night. The person making that call, the last person to see 5-year-old Haleigh Cummings alive, was hiding something so dark, so twisted, that even seasoned detectives couldn't piece it together. And exactly 30 days after that little girl vanished from her bed, that same 17-year-old would walk down the aisle and marry Haleigh's father. This is the story of Haleigh Cummings, and I promise you, nothing about this case is what it seems. Let me take you back to where it all began. Satsuma, Florida, population less than 6,000, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where children ride bikes until the streetlights come on, where doors are left unlocked and neighbors wave from their porches. It's the kind of town where nothing bad ever happens, until it did. Haleigh Cummings was born on August 17, 2003, to Ronald Cummings and Crystal Sheffield. From the moment she entered this world, the odds were stacked against her. Her parents were never married. Her mother was only 17 when she had Haleigh, and their relationship was anything but stable. Crystal Sheffield was 14 years old when she met Ronald Cummings. 14. One weekend, she went to stay with Ronald's family. She never left. She dropped out of 9th grade, and just a few years later, she gave birth to Haleigh. But Haleigh wasn't like other children. She was born with Turner syndrome, a rare chromosomal disorder that affects only females. The condition meant Haleigh would face heart defects, delayed puberty, learning disabilities, and growth issues. She needed to see specialists every single month, endocrinologists, cardiologists. Her life depended on consistent medical care. But by the time Haleigh turned 3, she had already missed 12 appointments. 12. And that wasn't even the worst part. One day, when Haleigh was still a toddler, she was found face down in a ditch filled with water, unresponsive, a child with special needs, left unattended, nearly drowned. And when authorities opened a case with Child Protective Services, what they discovered was even more disturbing. Ronald Cummings and Crystal Sheffield were deep into drugs, cocaine, heavy use, and their children were suffering because of it. A custody battle erupted. Ronald claimed Crystal's addiction made her an unfit mother. Crystal fired back, saying Ronald was the one who forced her into drugs, that he was violent, impulsive, a drug dealer. She said that when she tried to stop using while pregnant, Ronald would kick her, punch her in the head, and force the drugs back into her system. Family members backed up her story. They described Ronald as a wannabe gangster, racist, dangerous. But despite all of this, the courts sided with Ronald. He got primary custody. Crystal was allowed to see her children only twice a month. And the reason? Ronald had a job. It only paid $10 an hour, but it came with benefits. Crystal had nothing. So Haleigh and her little brother, Ronald Jr., went to live with their father, and for a while, things seemed okay. Haleigh was a typical 5-year-old. She loved mac and cheese. She played games on her little laptop. She adored makeup and movies, and more than anything, she loved spending time with her dad. But on February 9th, 2009, Ronald Cummings made a decision that would change everything. He left his children in the care of his 17-year-old girlfriend, a girl he had only known for a few months, a girl who had dropped out of school in 6th grade, a girl who had run away from home and used a fake name to buy a bus ticket to New Jersey. Her name was Misty Croslin, and she was about to become the most controversial figure in this entire case. Here's where things get strange. The weekend before Haleigh disappeared, Misty went on a bender. She left Ronald's house and spent 3 days drinking, doing drugs, and cheating on him. Ronald was furious. He tried to confront her, but she refused to see him. In a fit of rage, he drove to her friend's house and dumped all of her clothes on the front lawn. But then, on February 9th, Misty came back, just like that, and even though Ronald was still angry, he didn't have time to argue. He had to go to work, so he left his 2 young children, including a 5-year-old with special needs, in the care of a 17-year-old who had just spent the weekend partying. What could go wrong? That evening, Misty said she spent time with the kids. An air conditioner repairman stopped by briefly. Ronald's grandmother, Annette Sykes, dropped off some clothes. She found Misty and the kids on the porch, eating hamburger helper. Annette noticed the children weren't dressed warmly enough and told Misty to get them into warmer clothes. Then she left. A little while later, Misty's older brother, 23-year-old Hank Croslin Jr., who went by Tommy, stopped by. He and Misty smoked a joint together on the porch. Let me say that again. They smoked marijuana while Misty was supposed to be watching 2 small children. After Tommy left, Misty said she put on movies for the kids, Air Bud and Madagascar. She tucked them into bed at 8:15 p.m. because Haleigh had school the next day. Then Misty went to bed herself, in the same room as the children, and that's where the story starts to fall apart. At 3:27 a.m., a 911 call came in. Misty Croslin was on the line, frantic. She told the dispatcher she couldn't find her daughter, that she had just woken up, and the back door was hanging open. Now, let me stop here for a second. Misty didn't call Haleigh her stepdaughter. She didn't call her Ronald's daughter. She called her my daughter, and she had only known this child for a few months. But I'll come back to that. In the background of the 911 call, you can hear Ronald screaming. He's shouting Haleigh's name over and over. The dispatcher tells Misty to calm her husband down. Misty says the back door was wide open, propped open with a cinder block. She says Haleigh is gone. Then Ronald takes the phone, and what he says next is chilling. I need somebody to get here now. I just got home from work. My 5-year-old daughter is gone. I need somebody here now. I'm telling you, if I find whoever has my daughter before you do, I will kill them. I don't care if I spend the rest of my life in prison. You can put that on recording. I don't care. The dispatcher tries to keep Ronald on the line, but he's hysterical. He's screaming, swearing, crying, and then the line goes dead. The dispatcher calls back, but Ronald is so out of control that the call ends again. He yells, "Give me my phone. We've got better people to talk to than some people who aren't coming." Ronald then calls his grandmother, Annette. He's sobbing. "My baby is gone. My baby is gone. Get over here. Somebody took my baby." Police arrive at 3:40 a.m., 13 minutes after the 911 call. When they pull up, Ronald is outside, hysterical. He's screaming, crying, punching things so hard that the skin on his knuckles is peeled back, exposing raw flesh. He's yelling at Misty, demanding answers. What happened to Haleigh? You were supposed to be watching her. A deputy approaches Ronald to get information about Haleigh. In his report, the deputy notes that Ronald kept saying, "My dumb effing girlfriend told me my daughter is missing." Ronald is convinced of one thing: Haleigh would never have left on her own. The door had been dead-bolted when he left for work. There was no way a tiny 5-year-old could have opened it by herself. And then, investigators talk to 3-year-old Junior, and what he says stops everyone in their tracks. He says he saw a man dressed in black come into the bedroom and take Haleigh while she was sleeping. Now, you'd think that would be the breakthrough investigators needed. But here's the problem. There was no evidence to support Junior's story. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. And Junior was only 3 years old. Could he be trusted, or was he confused, scared, maybe even coached? Tracking dogs are brought in. They head toward the murky St. Johns River, about a quarter-mile from the trailer. But Haleigh is nowhere to be found. An Amber Alert is issued at 9:30 a.m. The alert includes details Misty left out of the 911 call. Haleigh's ears are pierced. She has a birthmark in front of her left ear, another 4-inch birthmark on the lower left side of her back. Investigators go door to door. They interview neighbors. They check surveillance cameras. And then they discover something alarming. There are 44 registered offenders living in the area. 44. Each one has to be cleared. Each one has to be investigated. Meanwhile, Ronald and Misty are brought in for questioning. At one point, investigators let Ronald into the room where Misty is being held so they can talk privately. The camera footage is haunting. Ronald is grilling Misty. How did you not wake up? How did you not hear anything? What happened to my daughter? And Misty? She looks shaken, scared. But is it fear or is it guilt? As the day goes on, reinforcements pour in. The FBI, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the state child abduction response team. Less than 10 hours after the 911 call, over 200 law enforcement officers are searching for Haleigh. Volunteers join the search. Great-Grandma Annette is out there, combing through the woods. Cars are stopped. Divers search nearby bodies of water. Helicopters scan from above. People on horses search the rural terrain of northeast Florida. And at 4 p.m., law enforcement makes an announcement. They believe Haleigh has been abducted. But by who and why? As investigators dig deeper, they start to uncover things about Ronald Cummings that raise serious red flags. In 2001, Ronald was arrested for threatening to kill someone. Over the next several years, he was arrested multiple times for drug possession, and his childhood, it wasn't much better. Ronald was raised primarily by his grandparents because his mother couldn't find a reliable babysitter. His grandmother, Annette, eventually took over as his primary guardian after Ronald was found wandering in the woods as a child when his babysitter wasn't watching him. Sound familiar? Just like Haleigh being found face down in that ditch. Despite his troubled past, Annette insists Ronald is a good father. She tells investigators he would never harm his children. And here's the thing, Ronald's alibi checks out. He was at work, time-stamped, verified. There's no way he could have been involved in Haleigh's disappearance. But Misty, that's a different story. Misty's story doesn't make sense. She keeps changing details. First, she says the house was locked up before she went to bed, but when she woke up, there was a cinder block propping open the side door by the laundry room. Investigators check. There's a pile of clean and dirty laundry in front of that door. No sign that anyone came through there. Then there's the issue of what Haleigh was wearing. Misty tells the 911 operator that Haleigh was last seen wearing pajamas, but then she tells detectives that Haleigh was wearing a pink Hannah Montana shirt. Investigators find the Hannah Montana shirt on top of the laundry pile by that side door. And then there's the question of where Haleigh went to sleep. At first, Misty says Haleigh fell asleep in bed with her and Junior. Then she changes her story and says Haleigh fell asleep in her own bed. And then she changes it again and says she woke up to go to the bathroom. But then she says she woke up to get a drink of water. None of it adds up. Because of all these inconsistencies, suspicion falls heavily on Misty. Investigators dig into her past, and what they find is disturbing. Misty dropped out of school in 6th grade. She ran away from home. She used a fake name to buy a bus pass to New Jersey. People who knew her describe her as emotionally detached, cold, almost robotic. And then there's the allegation that Misty was harmed as a child, that she was even pregnant at one point as a teenager. But none of this is confirmed. It's all speculation, rumors, gossip. Still, one thing becomes clear. Law enforcement doesn't trust Misty. They think she knows more than she's saying, and they're determined to find out what she's hiding, because Ronald isn't allowed back into his home while the investigation is ongoing. He, Misty, and his grandmother Annette pitch a tent in a neighbor's front yard. They want to stay close in case there's any news about Haleigh. And on the other end of the street, Haleigh's mother, Crystal, and her family pitch their own tent. Both sides of the family want to be nearby. The community rallies around them. People bring food, blankets, supplies. Even George Anthony, the grandfather of Kaylee Anthony, shows up to help with the search, though that doesn't last long. Haleigh's family eventually tells the Anthonys they don't want their involvement. A week and a half into the search, Haleigh's story has gone national. Popular news host Geraldo Rivera shows up to report on the case, but he's issued a trespass warning after getting into a verbal confrontation with Ronald. Geraldo asks Ronald about his past with drugs and abuse. Ronald doesn't take kindly to it. Family members appear on different news programs, including The Nancy Grace Show. Everyone has theories. Everyone has opinions. Haleigh's face is everywhere, but despite the massive media attention, investigators still have no idea where she is. And then, 1 month after Haleigh's disappearance, something happens that shocks the entire nation. On March 9, 2009, exactly 30 days after Haleigh vanished, Ronald and Misty go out to eat at the local Chili's. They're with several family members, and at one point during the meal, Ronald pulls out his grandmother's diamond ring, and he proposes to Misty. Misty doesn't hesitate. She says yes. Her parents have to sign off on the marriage because she's only 17, and they do. 3 days later, Ronald and Misty get married in an outdoor backyard ceremony. The church they wanted to get married at refused to perform the ceremony because the pastor didn't approve of the union. Let me say that again. 1 month after his daughter disappeared, Ronald Cummings married the last person to see her alive. And if that wasn't bizarre enough, the day after the wedding, Ronald and Misty traveled to New York City to appear on the Today Show. The public is outraged. People can't understand why, in the middle of a massive search for his missing daughter, Ronald would get married and then fly to New York for a television appearance. Crystal's attorney, Kim Picazio, tells the media, "Any common-sense, right-thinking person would think it's horrific. That's an understatement for him to get married or even get engaged as the sheriff is searching fields for his daughter. Most people agree if your child is missing, you're out there every single day doing everything you possibly can to bring them home. You're not getting married. You're not going on talk shows. You're searching." But Ronald and Misty defend their decision. On the Today Show, when asked why they got married, Ronald says, "I don't understand why it's any of anybody else's business, to be honest with you. It's nobody's business what I do in my personal life." The host presses him, "But can you understand why some people might be confused by it?" Ronald snaps back, "I don't know what my personal life has to do with national TV. My daughter is missing. That's what has to do with national TV. We need to get my daughter's face back on TV and get her found." Misty is also asked about the inconsistencies in her story. Why did she say one thing to the 911 operator and something completely different to detectives? After a long pause, Misty says, "I don't know why." She also admits that she walked out of an interview with investigators earlier in the week because she felt like she wasn't being treated right, that she was being made out to be a liar. The interviewed doesn't help their case. If anything, it makes people even more suspicious. After returning from New York, the newlyweds move into Ronald's grandmother, Annette's house. Investigators have cleared the trailer and given them permission to move back in, but they refuse. And the marriage, it's not off to a good start. Ronald isn't coping well. Annette says she often finds him lying on the floor, holding Haleigh's photo, crying, and talking to the picture. Meanwhile, rumors in the media continue to spread like wildfire. At one point, the media reports that Haleigh's skeletal remains have been found, but it turns out to be the remains of an alligator, not Haleigh. Months pass, no arrests are made. Law enforcement doesn't have much to go on. And then, the sheriff on the case, Jeff Hardy, makes a public statement. He says Misty isn't a suspect, but she knows more than she's letting on. The only consistent thing about her, he says, is the inconsistencies. And then it comes out. Misty lied about passing a polygraph test. She didn't pass. She failed, not just once, 4 times. She also failed a voice stress test. And then Misty's story changes again. This time, she brings up a new name, her older cousin, Joe Overstreet. Misty claims that Joe harmed her as a child, and on the day Haleigh disappeared, February 10th, Joe left the state and went back to Tennessee. Investigators learn that Joe was on probation at the time and broke his probation by going to Florida. They also learn that on his way out of the state, the car he was in was searched at a checkpoint. Haleigh wasn't in the car. No evidence of her ever being in the car. Joe is ruled out as a suspect, but his name keeps coming up. Misty's brother Tommy tells his attorney that Joe killed Haleigh. He says Joe came over to borrow a hunting rifle, and when he couldn't find it, he lost his temper. Tommy says Joe strangled Haleigh, put her in a black bag, and took her down to the dock behind the house. He says Joe had a concrete block, a bat, and a rope. Misty backs up Tommy's story. She tells investigators that Joe put Haleigh in a black bag and took her away. But here's the problem. There's no evidence. The river behind the house is searched. Divers go in. Nothing. No body. No bag. No trace of Haleigh. And remember, Misty never mentioned Joe coming over the day of Haleigh's disappearance. In her original story, she said only Annette, Tommy, and the air conditioning repairman came by. So why is she suddenly bringing up Joe now? Because of Misty's track record of lying, Joe is never charged. His involvement remains nothing more than a theory. On August 6, 2009, Ronald is arrested around midnight for burglary with assault. He got into an argument with Misty's father and brother. Misty had called them and said she didn't want to live there anymore. They came to pick her up. Violence erupted. They drove away and called 911. Ronald was arrested, but the next morning, Ronald is released on bail. And who picks him up from jail? Misty. They're back together. Talk about toxic. On August 17th, Haleigh's 6th birthday, a press conference is held. Law enforcement announces that they consider Misty key in Haleigh's disappearance. They say physical evidence contradicts her account of what she was doing that night. The sheriff's office says they no longer believe Haleigh was taken by a stranger, and they make it clear Ronald and Crystal are not suspects. That night, there's a balloon release in Haleigh's memory. A school supply drive is held, and 2 days later, Texas EquuSearch announces that Misty has taken another polygraph test in Florida. She failed it again. Massive deceptions. At the end of September, over 7 months after Haleigh disappeared, new information comes out. Multiple people claim to be witnesses at a party where Misty was on February 9th, the same night Haleigh disappeared, and they say Haleigh got into drugs, overdosed, and died before being taken to a pond. But here's the thing, why would nobody call the police for 7 months? Why would they stay silent if a child died? Investigators get a tip about a pond called Ayla Pond. They drain it. Haleigh isn't there. Then comes the bombshell. The Putnam County Sheriff's Office announces that no one was able to reach Misty on the night of Haleigh's disappearance. Phone records show that Ronald tried calling her 20 times. She didn't answer once, not even once. Misty's brother also went to the house that night. He says all the lights were off and no one answered the door. So where was Misty? Was she at a party, like the witnesses claim, or was she asleep, or was she somewhere else entirely? On October 6th, Ronald and Misty's attorneys announced that the couple is getting a divorce. 9 days later, the divorce is finalized, the fastest divorce I've ever heard of. Ronald goes on the Nancy Grace show and says, "Family problems, everything else, doomed our marriage." And just like that, the marriage is over. The case of missing 5-year-old Haleigh Cummings fades from the headlines. Law enforcement and bounty hunters leave town. Over 4,000 tips have been followed up on. Nothing has turned up. And Ronald and Misty, they go back to their old ways. Drug use, drug dealing. Misty's dad, Hank Croslin Sr., files a police report against Ronald, saying the drugs he bought from his ex-son-in-law practically killed him. Misty and her friends go out to buy drugs one day and get robbed. An investigation is launched. Both Misty and Ronald are ultimately arrested for drug possession and selling. The police department issues a statement saying the arrests have nothing to do with Haleigh, but the drug use doesn't stop. In January of 2010, police get a tip that Misty is trying to sell OxyContin pills. A month-long undercover operation is launched, and on January 20th, 2010, multiple arrests are made. Misty, Ronald, Tommy, and two of Misty's friends, all arrested for drug trafficking. Undercover officers bought over 300 pills from the group on 7 different occasions. Misty gets the harshest sentence, 25 years in prison. Ronald and the rest of the crew get 15 years. In 2012, Misty does a jailhouse interview, and what she says is shocking. She says, "I just feel like I need to speak my mind. There's nothing new. I just want to get my side out there, because everybody's against me. It seems like I'm in here in prison over some stuff that I shouldn't even be here for." She insists she's innocent, that she has nothing to do with Haleigh's disappearance. And then she tells a completely new story. She says, "We put Haleigh on the bus. We did everything we were supposed to do. Ronald brought Haleigh home. I cooked dinner. I gave her a bath. We played. Then we lay down and went to sleep. And then I woke up. I don't know why I woke up. I woke up and the kitchen light was on, and I ran to the bathroom. I ran to the kitchen to see what was going on. I thought maybe Ronald was home. He wasn't there, so I run to my room to get my cell phone to call him. He wouldn't answer his phone. Over 20 times, I turn around, and she's not in her bed, so I'm running around the house, freaking out because she's not in her bed. She's not nowhere in the house. And then 5 minutes later, Ronald's pulling down the driveway, and he didn't even really look like he was upset. He just looked like he was more messed up on drugs. And when I called him, like 20 or 30 times, I called him, he didn't answer the phone. And then the police come, and then she says something that changes everything. It has nothing to do with me. I think they were trying to get back at Ronald. Whoever did this. See, what I was told, Ronald used to sell drugs a lot before we got together, and he owed people money. See, one day we're at this bar, his family-owned bar, and I was sitting in the truck. I got out the truck and was standing, started to walk up to Ronald, and this black man was talking to him, and Ronald's like, "I need you to go sit back in the truck." I said, "Why? Why can't I hear?" And the black man said that he knows where Haleigh is. The Mexicans have her, and if Ronald pays this much money back, then he'll go get her on Friday. She pauses. That was a long time ago. I don't know who would have took her. I don't understand why they would have took her. It just doesn't make sense to me. And then she talks about the abuse. I guess I could talk about the abuse that Ronald gave to us. All of us. Me, Haleigh, and Junior went through abuse with him. He was always messed up on pills. He used to beat us all the time if the kids would get in trouble, and I would tell him to stop. Like he smacked his son in the face, and I got mad at him. I said, "Don't do that." He started beating He laughed about it, and I got beat up for it. Because I stuck up for the kids all the time, you know. I had them kids 24/7. I took care of them kids. I gave them baths, took them to school, fed them, done everything with them. Their family didn't do anything, and they're out here putting blame on somebody that they shouldn't be putting blame on. And all I tried to do was be a mother figure to them, because they didn't have a mother. And it just hurts me walking around here every day, and just knowing that the police even think that. Sadly, to this day, Haleigh has not been found. There has been no arrest made in her case. Haleigh is one of Florida's 7 unsolved Amber Alerts, and people have been left stumped. Investigators have made it clear that the chances of Haleigh's disappearance being the result of a stranger abduction are not likely, and that it is evident that Misty knows more than what she is willing to say to authorities. Haleigh has never been pronounced legally dead, but it's been made clear that investigators don't believe she's alive. In 2019, the investigators on the case in Putnam County stated that they believe Haleigh died from an accidental overdose of prescription drugs, and that her body was dumped in a river, but with no confessions and no recovered body. It is impossible to make an arrest or be sure of what happened to Haleigh that February night. Theories still run rampant. Some think Misty's brother Tommy did something to Haleigh while under the influence. Others think Misty herself was under the influence and not paying attention to her surroundings. But again, these are all just theories with no hard evidence. It is sad to think that Haleigh would have celebrated her 20th birthday recently. The remaining people in Haleigh's life have attempted to pick up the pieces and move forward the best they can, all while hoping that one day justice is served. Her great-grandmother Annette kept hope over the years. She kept all of the gifts that people had sent for Haleigh at her house. Annette was unfortunately diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in both her lungs and her liver, and sadly, she died earlier this year, before getting the answers she desperately was seeking. Ronald was released from prison last year, but while in prison, he was no saint. He got in trouble often, fighting, unauthorized use of drugs, possessing weapons. He never stayed out of trouble for long. In October of 2022, Ronald was released early due to qualifying for incentive gain time after serving 85% of his sentence. But Ronald's second chance at life was short-lived, because on Christmas Day of 2022, he was arrested again. Officers were called to the scene of a car crash where they found Ronald passed out at the wheel with a bottle of liquor on his lap and the engine still running. After several attempts to wake Ronald up, it was clear he was severely intoxicated. He tried to get out of his car, but then sat back down and attempted to turn the car back on after an officer had shut it off. The officer kept telling Ronald to get out of the vehicle, but Ronald refused, which led to him physically being pulled out. This only made Ronald more belligerent. Ronald pushed the officer and tried to get the gun from the deputy's holster. After a lot of physical and verbal resistance, officers were able to finally detain him. Oxycodone and a bag of marijuana were found on Ronald, and in his car. Ronald was sent to the Putnam County Jail on a $185,000 bond, where he still is today. Misty, on the other hand, is still in prison. She isn't set to be released until 2031. She also has had a hard time staying out of trouble in prison. She has been written up multiple times for a sex act, possession of contraband, spoken threats, and so much more. Haleigh's mother, Crystal, eventually got married and now goes by Crystal Griffin. She was given custody over Junior and even allowed for visits from Ronald's grandmother Annette up until 4 years ago. For unknown reasons, Crystal was arrested in 2013 for theft and disorderly intoxication, and then again in 2014 for a drug paraphernalia charge. But after that arrest, Crystal has gone on to live a quiet life with her family, still residing in Florida. Truly though, there are still so many questions about this case. Why was Misty unable to keep her story straight? Was Misty home all night, or did she go to a party? Why did Ronald leave his kids with Misty in the first place after her crazy bender of a weekend? Why were Misty and Ronald acting so impulsive so soon after Haleigh's disappearance? Was this just a case of a child getting into a drug dealer's stash and Misty panicking in that moment? There are so many red flags in this case. Let's just hope that whoever did something to Haleigh is held accountable and that Haleigh can get the justice that she deserves. It seems like the only thing that's certain is that poor little Haleigh never stood a chance in the drug-filled, deceptive, criminal-minded family that she was born into. We can only hope that this sweet little girl can be found, and that whoever is responsible will be properly punished. But here's the haunting question that keeps me up at night. What if Misty was telling the truth about Ronald owing money to dangerous people? What if Haleigh was taken as collateral? What if she's still out there somewhere, living under a different name, with no memory of who she really is? We may never know, and that's what makes this case so terrifying. If this story shocked you, check the video on your screen now. I believe it was made for you.